So where is 500 billion going to come from if government is paying about 600 B every year in debt repayments? And then, of course, there are salaries that have to be paid. So the AU petitioned for debt relief, and these conversations have been going on. And there's two different platforms negotiating for debt relief, and we have somebody today who's going to help us understand exactly what these negotiations are, and also look at why the government of Kenya is saying they don't want to take debt relief, when we can hear in real terms the needs of Kenyans aren't being met. Government can't meet them. Kenyans are used to meeting their own needs. Right now, Kenyans are at home, haven't been working, do not have the money to meet their needs. So is this the time for Kenya not to be taking debt relief? And what are these conditions that come around debt relief? And how can we contribute to this conversation? Yes, so we asked Andrew Gogo, who's with Oxfam. He's a program officer with Oxfam. And Oxfam internationally looks at the issue of debt, and they do so from a tax justice point of view, because debt, government makes it sound like they're going to negotiate with another big government, another country or some other agency to procure debt. But it's our taxes. And right now there's a finance bill that seeks to increase consumer taxes to make the poorest pay for this debt. So really, debt is a tax justice issue, and Andrews should be on the line anytime to help us untangle this and also inform us, educate us a little bit.
Indeed. Andrew is actually joining us now on the line. He's a tax justice program officer with Oxfam in Kenya. We're talking about that debt and, well, why is it that we're not taking up this offer by these European countries to make it easier for us? We spoke with the CS for the National Treasury, Ukuri Atani, the other day, and you alluded to the kind of thinking that the National Treasury was having at that time. But let's get into speaking with Andrew. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
First things first. So Wanjiru has just done a good introduction of where we are at as a country in terms of our debt burden, how much we ought to be repaying, and then the kind of avenues that we have now with the situation of COVID and what COVID has presented to us is an opportunity to not be able to pay this debt for a while. So the offer that has been given to us after the negotiation by the AU countries to the EU countries and the National Treasury's response to it, what do you make of it? And first of all, what is it that the National Treasury is saying?
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the whole debt issue started way before COVID. What COVID did is it kind of accelerated and sort of affected the economy, and we're seeing more borrowing towards the COVID fund. But more specifically to what Treasury has alluded to in terms of trying to stay away from the EU debt relief. This is because, in my opinion, is that the government is conflicted on whether to risk being downgraded by the rating agencies, which will in turn impact on their access to commercial market and interest rates.
Yeah.
So what essentially this will do is it will lower our rating as a country, and we won't be able to access certain markets that have obviously been lucrative in the past.
This includes like the Eurobond and the rest that we have taken.
Yes, as we are all aware.
So is this part of the condition? Are you saying that this is part of the condition that the EU is giving, that if we do this, no, not the condition, but basically it's going to be a result of that. If we do this, then the rating agencies like Moody's are going to say, all right, so you guys, now we move it from B to C.
Yes, because what essentially it does, it sort of bails us out. Yeah, so it shows that we do not have the capacity, or rather the structural framework to manage certain debts. So that kind of lowers the rating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what works for us? I mean, if we, first of all, we're heavily indebted. Is government keen on holding on to the rating just so that they can go back to the commercial markets to borrow, or are there other risks to the credit rating going south, as it were?
I think for any government, it would be important to obviously keep your options open, because what we have is sort of we have an optimistic nature in terms of how the economy is meant to improve. I think what the current situation that we are seeing with COVID is that things have literally just been put on standstill, and the steady growth that we were observing before COVID has now literally disappeared. So it's a very a new situation to most governments. And in this particular situation, I think what the government of Kenya is trying to do is just to ensure that we're not getting into some certain arguments where it hinders us in the future.
Down the road.
Andrew, is that the option, the heavy borrowing that we've been seeing, is that the only option that governments can take, that the government of Kenya can take to help in this situation? Is borrowing the answer?
So essentially, and if you look at developed countries, the best way to finance economic development is through domestic resource mobilization. But if you look at the capacity of Kenya and the institutions such as the Kenya Revenue Authority to sort of raise revenues, I think it's now the 5th year that KRA has failed to meet the target. So I think that would be the best option, and that's what developed countries focus on. But then if you look at our capacity, if you look at our revenue streams, we have to borrow to supplement a disjointed budget.
Right, because if borrowing is being done for developmental causes, I have no problem with this. But we've seen that money that has come in or has been agreed upon in this last month is to meet a budget deficit for the year that is ending this month. So, I mean, how do we reconcile that? Whereby if we're saying we can borrow and put it into development projects and then move the country a couple of inches forward. But if we're looking at borrowing money to make up for what is essentially a year that is gone, aren't we putting ourselves in deeper problems?
So you can look at this in two ways, whereby you're looking at some of the assessment that has been done by the IMF and the World Bank in terms of Kenya's steady economic growth. But then that does not necessarily translate to, improved quality of life, improved public service delivery. And the other way you can look at it is through ensuring that some of this sort of revenue generated, it's not enough. It's not going to be able to obviously supplement the budget. And we're looking at devolution in this aspect, whereby county governments need more money to be allocated to them. But then the county governments in themselves cannot raise resources. So you look at that constraint and the need to raise the resources using other means.
Andrew, you've talked about two things, because you said, so one you're saying is we don't have enough money to deal with COVID and also meet our development needs. So we need to borrow. But where should we be borrowing from? And at this point, should we be concerned about our rating, or can we borrow from, other avenues where we don't have to worry about that rating? Because I understand that the rating has to do with the commercial markets. So what kind of debt should we be looking at? And given the kind of debt we are looking at, can we then afford, do we have an option where we can get the relief and still borrow from sources that aren't then too concerned that we had to take relief? And then the second question is, you talked about the disjointed budget and what are these disjoints? But maybe first you can tell us, is there a way we can borrow? And should we be going for the debt relief? And where can we borrow and take the debt relief? What's the responsible thing to do for the country?
Yeah. So, just to address the first question, in terms of borrowing, I think most countries indeed have to borrow. I think a country like Japan, which is relatively one of the first world countries, does have to borrow to ensure that they're able to gain maximum economic benefits. But then a country such as Kenya, which is developing, we do not have that kind of leverage. If you look at our GDP, if you look at our economic growth, it's not as high. If you look at our productivity locally, we do not have the same sort of productivity that a country like Japan enjoys. So, and if you look at it in Kenya's perspective, I think some of the decisions we've made have not generally paid off, and that's focusing on infrastructure-led development. And we really banked on that working out, and obviously at the time when we were negotiating for some of these debts, then we thought we were at a very comfortable position to have them repaid in a couple of years through obviously the infrastructure-led growth. But then that seems to not have paid off completely. And if you look at our debt payment, it's 60% of our budget, and that's not really a convenient situation to be in. So if you look at maybe the 40% that's remaining is normally going towards recurrent expenditure. So there's very little that is left that goes to public spending, such as in the essential services like the health sector, as well as education and sanitation.
Andrew, our country has gradually gone towards a mix that is slanting more towards commercial debt. It's expensive commercial debt, and our concessional debt is basically just reducing. In this situation where we are, is it possible for us to negotiate with our commercial lenders? In any way?
So what obviously economists try to advise countries is that we should probably avoid commercial debt, because the problem with commercial debt is that they're normally short term, and the interest rates are quite high. So you find that countries would rather explore other avenues like multilateral debt from some of these international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, rather than go for the commercial debt, which then increases the burden on the taxpayer.
Does our credit rating matter to the IMF and to the World Bank?
It actually does. So I think around 2018, the World Bank had Kenya as medium distress levels in terms of debt repayment. But then it's a bit confusing sometimes, considering Kenya normally is in the bad books, then it's in the good books of some of these international financial institutions, whereby you find that there was a long point, where we were not able to access some of these multilateral loans from some of this from the IMF. But then most recently we were able to access, and now you can see there's a lot of debt that is streaming in, and we could actually allude to the fact that COVID is what has made us have the need to borrow. But then this process was already ongoing prior to obviously the COVID pandemic. So it's something that we were already on that path in terms of negotiating for these loans, and it was already unsustainable to some point, whereby you're looking at the economic growth, but it's not really painting the real picture in terms of improvement of livelihoods and standard of living.
Are you telling us we need to go for debt relief, or that if we go for debt relief, then we won't be able to get other debt?
Commercial debt.
No, we are saying we don't want commercial debt, but then Andrew's also telling us that IMF, World Bank, if we go for the debt relief, they'll look at our rating, we won't get. So are we in a catch-22? Or should we get the relief and then negotiate with IMF?
And cross the bridges after.
As it comes, as we normally do. You said we can enter the house through the window.
Yeah.
The roof.
So
It's on fire.
I think
So
it's always good to keep your options open, and I think we can, as long as we're able to show that we are able to sustainably repay debt. I think even if you look at the percentage of the commercial debt and the other multilateral debt, it does not make the biggest percentage in terms of our obligations to pay. If you look at our bilateral debt owed to other countries, for example, such as China, that makes almost 70% of what we owe. So the question here is not if we are able to access whatever kind of debt. The question is, how are we able to responsibly pay this debt without having it affect the taxpayer and in some very adverse ways.
Good thing that you've brought in the taxpayer here. You're a tax justice program officer with Oxfam in Kenya. Where does the taxpayer come in all these conversations? Even now that we're talking about debt relief and negotiations and all, where does the taxpayer come in? Well, apart from paying the tax so that we pay the debt.
I know this is a very important question. I mean, people always think I work for KRA when I talk about being part of tax justice. So they wonder where our tax is going. But just sort of in a nutshell, I mean, it's if you look at how KRA raises revenue, it's from salary, salaried individuals, pay as you earn, and I know you guys have a thing or two to say about that.
Yeah.
And it's also from, obviously, companies, from the, corporate income tax.
Yeah.
So if you look at other revenues, for example, like property tax, that does not necessarily bring in a lot of the bucks that KRA has. So we're looking at either taxpayers and obviously business licenses and businesses. So in an ideal society, you would then have those people who are able to pay tax, pay a huge a proportion of it.
Yeah.
And that's what we call, progressivity of tax policies, whereby you ensure that vulnerable people and poor and the poor do not bear the burden of tax of the tax payment.
Just call it what it is. Tax the rich.
Yes. So that's what we try to advocate for. At Oxfam, and then, with all our partners in Kenya, where we're looking at ensuring that, for example, if you look at pay as you earn, it's 25% at the moment. But if you look at the capital gains tax, it's at 5%.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be at 3%, but now it's at 5%.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at in terms of who owns property, it has to be people who, if you're going to transfer property, you might as well, be in a position to maybe, be able to afford a meal, or, be able to, take care of your family and stuff like that. So, we're just looking at some of the disparities. And also, if you look at the situation at the moment, whereby we're seeing that the corporate income tax has also been reduced to sort of, help cushion some of these companies from the COVID disaster. So the problem is that, what about the informal sector, where majority of the workforce is, and the majority of Kenyans sort of, get their daily bread. If these huge companies who probably are able have, emergency funds to, cushion in such times, like, are we thinking about the informal sector?
Yeah.
So the informal sector is not able to negotiate for themselves, and when
Is the informal sector paying tax anyway?
And that's a good question, because that also falls under the capacity of KRA to raise taxes, because you find that there's a lot of revenue streams that are not, they have not sort of explored, and that's the informal sector. And, what's the right way of trying to, tax the informal sector? So that's something that I think KRA has been trying to do for a while now. Also taxing the digital economy to raise taxes. So I think that we're on the right path. It's just that we haven't really gotten the right formula to do this.
So are we in a situation of tax justice or tax injustice, especially when IMF comes into the picture and they say, let's raise VAT, let's raise other forms of consumer tax?
Yeah. So, if you look at the consumer taxes, and, raising VAT directly affects the poor. Because if you look at some of the commodities that the poor needs to, or rather the vulnerable households that, need to, to use in everyday sort of, living, some of these commodities are very, if you raise it by 2%, that's a lot. Some of the people are surviving with under $1 a day. So if you're raising the VAT on sugar, on unga and all these other things, then and lowering things like capital gains tax. For instance, in Uganda, the capital gains tax is 30%. And I think that's something that we should be aspiring to.
What?
Where?
Kwani?
From 5% to 30%.
You're talking to the wrong person. You're talking to property holders here, Andrew. Be careful. You'll be cut off next.
I am sorry. I just to be the devil's advocate, but yes. Essentially, that's what. If we had our taxes working for us, then we would not be complaining in terms of being heavily taxed. If you look at some of the Nordic countries, they pay over 50% in terms of taxes. So,
however, but you can see the direct result of those taxes that they pay. It works for them because they don't have to complain about things that we've talked about, for example, like roads and infrastructure, and then education, a health system. They don't have to complain about that because they can see the direct result of this heavy tax that they pay. For looking at the Nordic countries as an example, here not so much.
But you're not paying much.
No, of course we pay.
Oh,
we pay
come
a
on,
lot.
you pay a lot of money.
Not only do we pay a lot, we then pay for the services.
Yeah.
You see
So,
now,
so
if
we don't get.
the
Actually,
argument
we
that
need to do a major
Andrew may bring in the argument
tax
here. If you're not
justice
paying as much as the
engagement.
Nordic countries are paying, then stop comparing yourselves with them.
Omo, this one, they're paying so much and you're barely scraping the bottom of the pan in this one. So I would say, look, if with what is being paid, and I stand to be corrected, but in Kenya, for what is being paid, just take VAT alone. For what is being paid, if you can actually receive a certain result, then I don't think people would have such a big problem if they're going to say, okay, let's increase it a little more and let's see what we can deliver, to the point whereby people are satisfied, don't even have to bat an eyelid then when it comes to services.
Andrew, just respond to that.
Yes, I mean, and that's where we come in as a citizen.